Have you ever stopped to think about what your most fundamental beliefs are really based on? What if the concepts you take for granted, like cause and effect, good and evil, and even your own sense of self, are just illusions created by your mind? Nearly 3 centuries ago, the philosopher David Hume dared to expose a deep and unsettling crack in the very foundation of human knowledge. His ideas were so radical that they still make scientists and thinkers question what we consider to be reality. Hume showed that our most certain knowledge, from scientific laws to moral principles, rests on the surprisingly shaky ground of habit and belief, not on solid logic. In this video, we'll take an intellectual journey through Hume's most provocative ideas. Get ready to question everything you thought you knew. What you're about to hear could forever change how you see the world and yourself. Let's get started. Part 1. The Is-Ought Problem. David Hume identified what remains one of the most profound logical challenges in moral philosophy, a problem that still troubles those who attempt to derive ethical conclusions solely from empirical observations. At the center of this issue is a vital distinction between statements that describe what is and those that prescribe what ought to be. Hume pointed out a deep and persistent logical divide between factual descriptions and moral prescriptions. No matter how comprehensive our understanding of the world might be, it cannot, by itself, yield moral conclusions unless we already accept certain ethical principles. This observation, now known as the Is-Ought Problem, or Hume's guillotine, reshaped philosophical thinking by highlighting the gap between facts and values, between science and ethics, and between rational analysis and moral judgment. The issue becomes especially clear when examining common patterns of moral argumentation that attempt to move directly from facts to values. Consider, for example, the argument that stealing is wrong because it causes harm, undermines trust in society, and disrupts economic cooperation. These are empirical claims that may well be backed by evidence. Yet, Hume insisted that these observations alone do not suffice to establish that stealing is morally wrong. To arrive at that conclusion, one must also accept certain value-laden assumptions, such as the idea that causing unnecessary harm is morally bad, or that social trust and cooperation are ethical goods. Without such normative premises, the factual claim that stealing causes harm does not logically imply that it is wrong. The key insight here is that these moral assumptions cannot themselves be derived from facts. Attempts to ground them in observation inevitably reintroduce values that cannot be justified through empirical evidence alone, thus falling back into the same logical error. Any move from a descriptive statement to a normative one involves the implicit introduction of evaluative claims that are not rooted in fact. Hume exposed this flaw by closely analyzing the structure of moral reasoning. He observed that many ethical theories begin by laying out facts about human behavior, social norms, or the outcomes of actions. But at a certain point, these accounts invariably make a subtle shift from describing reality to prescribing moral duties or obligations. He famously noted his surprise when arguments transitioned from a series of factual statements, phrased in terms like is or is not, to conclusions expressed in terms like ought or ought not. This shift, often unnoticed, marks a logical leap that is not justified by the kind of reasoning that supported the earlier factual claims. Such a transition introduces fundamentally different concepts that require their own type of justification. Yet, many philosophers have traditionally glossed over this shift, treating the move from is to ought as if it required no special explanation. Hume, on the other hand, challenged them to make clear how such a leap could be logically supported and what kind of reasoning would be needed to bridge the gap. This observation had significant implications for Hume's broader understanding of the relationship between science and morality. While scientific inquiry is adept at revealing how the world works, explaining natural laws, social behavior, and causal relationships, it cannot, by its very nature, tell us what we should value or how we ought to act. Empirical investigation can illuminate the causes of moral beliefs and the effects of ethical systems, but it cannot, on its own, resolve normative questions. Despite the vast amount of knowledge science can provide about behavior, cognition, and society, it leaves unanswered the fundamental ethical question: what values should guide our choices as individuals and as communities? Science can inform our moral deliberations by clarifying the likely consequences of our actions, but it cannot, by itself, determine which actions are morally right or wrong. This reveals an essential distinction. The realms of scientific analysis and moral reflection are concerned with fundamentally different questions and require different methods of reasoning. Neither can be fully reduced to the other. Ultimately, Hume's critique shed light on often overlooked dimensions of moral reasoning, particularly the psychological and linguistic aspects of how we express and justify ethical beliefs. His analysis remains a powerful challenge to contemporary moral philosophers, urging them to grapple with the intricate relationship between facts and values, and to recognize the limits of rational argument in ethical discourse. Moral judgments are not merely reports about how things are in the world or society. They express personal evaluations of approval or disapproval that are deeply rooted in emotion and motivation. When someone asserts that honesty is admirable or that cruelty is unacceptable, they are doing more than describing behaviors and their outcomes. They are also expressing their internal moral sentiments and trying to influence the emotional and behavioral responses of others. In this way, moral language plays a dual role that contemporary philosophers describe as both descriptive and prescriptive. It communicates a moral stance while also aiming to shape attitudes and actions. Understanding this dual function helps explain why moral disagreements often trigger intense emotional reactions and carry greater significance than purely factual disputes. These conflicts reach beyond intellectual disagreement, touching upon deeply held values and social expectations. David Hume's renowned is-ought problem fundamentally reshaped how he and others understood the limits of reason in ethical thought. If moral conclusions cannot be directly derived from factual premises, then reason alone is insufficient for establishing moral truths, contrary to what earlier thinkers had assumed. Reason remains vital for tasks such as clarifying concepts, exposing contradictions, predicting consequences, and drawing attention to neglected aspects of moral scenarios. Yet it lacks the power to generate the basic moral commitments that give ethical reasoning its direction. According to Hume, those essential foundations stem from elsewhere, specifically from our inherent emotional dispositions and the social contexts explored in his moral psychology. This is not to suggest that moral thinking is irrational or arbitrary. Rather, it highlights that ethical reasoning is built on psychological and social mechanisms that operate differently from strict logical deduction. Hume's approach to resolving the is-ought dilemma involved moving away from attempts to construct moral rules through pure logic. Instead, he concentrated on uncovering the mental and societal processes through which moral beliefs emerge and function. He reframed the central concern of ethics from "how can moral claims be logically proven?" to "what are the real psychological and social origins of moral judgments, and what roles do they play in human life?" Viewed through this lens, moral philosophy is less about discovering timeless, abstract principles and more about investigating the emotional and societal dynamics that nurture ethical behavior and human flourishing. Ethics, in Hume's framework, aligns more naturally with empirical disciplines like psychology and sociology than with purely rational deductive systems. This naturalistic interpretation of the is-ought divide anticipated many later trends in moral philosophy that emphasize the psychological, cultural, and evolutionary underpinnings of ethical thought. While modern philosophers continue to wrestle with the logical challenge Hume identified, a growing number follow his lead in focusing on how moral cognition functions in practice rather than seeking rigid rational foundations for moral claims. This reorientation has energized a wide spectrum of research fields, including moral psychology, evolutionary ethics, experimental philosophy, and applied ethics, all of which prioritize real-world moral practices and the development of character traits that support both individual growth and collective well-being. Hume's insights into the is-ought problem remain foundational in contemporary discussions about the intersection of science and ethics, the architecture of moral reasoning, and the most fruitful ways to engage in ethical inquiry. Part 2. Justice and the Artificial Virtues. David Hume introduced a revolutionary perspective on justice and the development of social institutions, arguing that complex moral and political systems can emerge naturally from fundamental aspects of human psychology, without requiring centralized authority or intentional planning. In examining what he called artificial virtues, Hume revealed how enduring institutions like property rights, legal frameworks, and governments arise organically through collective human experience, rather than through coercion or formal agreement. Hume's approach marked a significant shift in political philosophy. Instead of relying on abstract theorizing or idealized models of governance, he emphasized an empirical understanding of how human behaviors and social interactions spontaneously give rise to moral norms and political order. He contended that exploring these naturally evolving systems offers deeper insight than designing theoretical utopias based purely on rational principles. His insights would later influence theories focused on spontaneous order, cultural evolution, and the unintended outcomes of individual actions. At the heart of Hume's theory is his distinction between two kinds of moral virtues, each grounded in different psychological processes and fulfilling distinct social functions. The first category, natural virtues, includes traits like compassion, gratitude, and generosity. These emerge directly from innate emotional capacities and do not depend on social learning or institutions. For instance, when someone instinctively helps another who is in distress, they are guided by a natural virtue, an immediate emotional response rooted in human nature. These virtues are universally recognized across cultures because they stem from deeply embedded features of human psychology and require no formal systems to be understood or expressed. In contrast, artificial virtues are not born from instinct, but evolve within specific social contexts. They include qualities such as fairness, respect for property, civic loyalty, and honesty in trade. These virtues rely on shared understandings and social conditioning, developing only through repeated interactions in structured environments. Among the artificial virtues, justice is the most prominent example of how a complex moral framework can arise without centralized direction or philosophical consensus. Hume sought to explain why societies come to establish rules around property, rules that often limit personal freedom by restricting access to shared resources. He argued that such rules are not the product of innate moral feelings or calculated logic, but emerge from a collective, experiential insight. When people restrain their impulses and coordinate their actions, everyone benefits more than they would in a state of unrestricted competition. In small communities where resources are abundant and personal relationships are close, informal sharing and interpersonal negotiation may suffice to maintain harmony. But as populations grow and resources become scarce, unregulated behavior leads to conflict and insecurity. Over time, individuals begin to recognize that mutual restraint and respect for rules, particularly those governing ownership and exchange, foster stability and cooperation. It is this growing awareness that gives rise to justice as a learned and socially constructed virtue. This understanding does not result from deliberate planning or philosophical agreement, but from repeated social interactions, where people observe that some patterns of behavior, like keeping promises and respecting others' claims, lead to greater harmony, while others cause disruption and loss. As these patterns are reinforced through positive outcomes, they gradually become established norms. When people consistently uphold each other's rights and fulfill their commitments, trust emerges. That trust, in turn, enables productive work, voluntary trade, and collaborative enterprise. Conversely, when such norms are ignored or violated, trust breaks down. Individuals become preoccupied with protecting what they have rather than contributing to collective prosperity, weakening the entire social fabric. Through this long-term adaptive process, successful communities develop increasingly sophisticated systems of law, property, and conflict resolution. These structures are not imposed from above or derived from abstract reasoning. Rather, they grow from simple psychological impulses like the desire for reciprocity and social cohesion. They represent the cumulative learning of societies discovering how best to organize life in ways that promote human flourishing. David Hume maintained that justice is not an innate moral instinct, but rather the outcome of a convention, a practice that emerges gradually through repeated social interaction, rather than formal agreement or institutional decree. In Hume's nuanced understanding, a convention is a stable, collectively beneficial pattern of behavior that solidifies over time without requiring centralized enforcement or explicit consent. To clarify this idea, consider how societies settle on driving on one side of the road. There's no inherent moral superiority in choosing the left or right. The critical factor is collective agreement. Safety and efficiency arise not from the side chosen, but from uniformity in adherence. As people recognize the advantages of coordination, the behavior becomes habitual and self-sustaining. Deviation results in confusion or harm, reinforcing the norm. Similarly, property rights evolve as practical conventions that allow individuals to coordinate their actions in mutually advantageous ways. These rights persist because violating them typically brings personal disadvantages, while respecting them reinforces social stability and individual gain. Viewing justice as a product of social convention carries profound implications for how we interpret moral disagreements and institutional differences across cultures. Since justice is not grounded in universal moral instincts, but in context-dependent norms, it follows that different societies will naturally develop varying rules regarding ownership, contracts, and governance. This recognition does not imply that all systems are equally valid or beyond critique. While social practices often reflect historical and cultural specificity, some institutional arrangements more effectively promote human well-being than others. It remains not only possible but essential to assess systems based on their ability to foster prosperity, stability, and fairness. Empirical analysis can help reveal the social and environmental factors that support the emergence and resilience of beneficial institutions. At the same time, this understanding suggests that moral and political theorists should shift their focus toward explaining how institutions naturally arise and evolve, rather than attempting to construct ideal systems from abstract philosophical principles alone. Designing political frameworks without accounting for human nature and social dynamics often results in unrealistic or unworkable proposals. Hume's insights into artificial virtues also have practical implications for both moral education and public policy. Since these virtues are acquired through participation in shared social norms, teaching morality should involve more than rote instruction in ethical rules. It should foster a deep appreciation for how moral and legal institutions function and why they matter. People are more likely to respect property laws, honor contracts, and follow regulations when they understand how such norms align with their own interests and contribute to a cooperative, orderly society. In the same way, effective political reform should aim for gradual improvement, working within the bounds of established practices. Radical overhauls that ignore existing social patterns often dismantle functioning systems without offering viable alternatives. Successful reform depends on recognizing the organic nature of institutional development. By working with, rather than against, the slow-moving processes through which social norms take root, it becomes possible to enact changes that enhance human flourishing while maintaining the cooperative frameworks essential to social order. Hume's theoretical framework anticipated many insights that would later shape disciplines such as economics, sociology, and political science. These fields have since emphasized the importance of spontaneous order, emergent norms, and the unintended outcomes of human behavior. His concept of justice as convention helped inspire economists exploring how markets self-regulate, political theorists studying the evolution of democratic institutions, and anthropologists analyzing the cultural foundations of legal and moral systems. By focusing on the unplanned and incremental nature of institutional development, Hume provided a middle path between two extremes: the individualist view that ignores the influence of social structures, and the collectivist stance that attributes institutions solely to deliberate planning. His nuanced approach remains highly relevant, offering enduring insights into current debates about the balance between personal freedom and collective responsibility, the proper role of government in economic life, and the intricate relationship between moral norms and political institutions. Part 3. Hume's Critique of Miracles and Religious Authority. David Hume articulated what many consider the most incisive philosophical challenge to the credibility of miracle reports, a critique so rigorously constructed and grounded in empirical reasoning that it continues to provoke debate among religious scholars nearly 3 centuries later. His analysis of miracles serves as a prime example of his broader philosophical strategy, subjecting long-held beliefs to the scrutiny of observation and probabilistic logic. Hume did not reject religion outright. Rather, he undertook a systematic and penetrating examination of the psychological mechanisms and logical foundations that sustain religious belief. His intention was to evaluate such claims not through appeals to tradition, authority, or faith, but by examining the evidence and applying rational analysis. In doing so, he illuminated significant weaknesses in the conventional ways that religious truths are justified and communicated. His discussion of miracles, in particular, became a landmark case of applying scientific reasoning to theological assertions. It helped establish a modern framework for assessing extraordinary claims, rooted in the principle that assertions which contradict established natural laws must be supported by equally exceptional evidence. Hume began by carefully defining what sets miracle claims apart from ordinary empirical events. A miracle, he stated, entails a violation of the laws of nature brought about by some divine or supernatural force. This characterization is crucial as it underscores the religious importance of miracles. They are understood as direct acts of intervention by a deity that interrupt the normal causal fabric of the universe. Yet, this very definition also exposes the philosophical tension inherent in miracle reports. Since miracles, by their nature, conflict with the most consistently verified principles of natural science, they must be exceedingly uncommon. Their rarity is not incidental, but essential. If such events happened frequently, they would no longer stand outside the natural order and would cease to be considered miraculous. From this foundation, Hume constructed the core of his argument. When an individual claims that a miracle has occurred, we are presented with a critical dilemma. Either the natural laws we know have been suspended, or the person making the claim is misinformed, deceived, or attempting to deceive others. To resolve this dilemma, Hume argued that we must appeal to our cumulative experience of the world. Our extensive observations confirm time and again the reliability and regularity of natural laws. In contrast, human testimony is fraught with error. People frequently misinterpret experiences, recall events inaccurately, make flawed judgments, or are influenced by emotional, cultural, or social factors that lead them to embellish or fabricate. In light of this disparity, Hume maintained that reason invariably supports the natural explanation over the supernatural one when evaluating reports of miracles. The body of empirical evidence that confirms the consistency of natural laws serves as what he called a full proof against any singular miracle report. Put simply, it is always more probable that the report is flawed than that a genuine violation of nature has occurred. Crucially, Hume did not assert that miracles are metaphysically impossible. His position was more subtle. He argued that belief in a miracle is never rational if it depends solely on human testimony. A rational person, he said, adjusts their belief to match the strength and reliability of the evidence, and in every instance, the testimony of nature outweighs the testimony of individuals. The more improbable a claim appears, the greater the burden of proof it carries. But no human account, regardless of its sincerity, detail, or consistency, can ever meet the standard required to overturn the deep and consistent body of evidence that underpins natural law. This reasoning led Hume to a bold and enduring conclusion. When the only support for a miracle is testimonial in nature, belief in that miracle is always intellectually unwarranted. Through this argument, Hume established a powerful philosophical obstacle to accepting miracle claims as rationally justified, an obstacle that continues to shape contemporary discussions on religious authority and the plausibility of supernatural events. Hume strengthened his argument against miracles by examining the historical and psychological settings in which such reports typically arise. He noted that accounts of miraculous events are most common in societies lacking scientific literacy, communities he characterized as either undereducated or culturally undeveloped, where people are more prone to interpret rare occurrences as acts of the supernatural. As civilizations advance and adopt more rigorous scientific methods and evidence-based thinking, the frequency and cultural significance of miracle claims tend to wane. This observable pattern throughout history suggests that belief in miracles stems more from unfamiliarity with natural causes than from any genuine divine intervention. Hume also highlighted how miracle stories often emerge alongside the rise of new religious movements or in contexts serving religious or political objectives. In such circumstances, the invention or embellishment of miraculous tales becomes a tool to legitimize authority or attract followers. The workings of the human mind are key here. People naturally seek meaning in improbable events and social dynamics, such as the desire to belong or conform, can lead individuals to accept and spread these stories, even when no supernatural occurrence has actually taken place. The broader significance of Hume's critique extends beyond miracle claims alone, raising essential questions about the nature of religious belief and the complex relationship between faith and reason. If miraculous events cannot withstand rational scrutiny grounded in evidence, then religious systems that rely on such events for validation are not supported by empirical reality, but rather by psychological and socio-cultural forces. This does not necessarily imply that religious belief is irrational, but it does indicate that faith operates independently of the evidentiary standards used in scientific reasoning. Those who persist in believing in miracles, despite contradictions and lack of proof, are often motivated by deeper human needs for meaning, identity, and belonging, rather than a commitment to logical coherence. According to Hume, understanding these psychological dimensions provides a more accurate and insightful approach to religious belief than traditional theological reasoning, which typically attempts to justify doctrine through logical argument. He argued that exploring the emotional and existential roles of religion yields a more profound grasp of human nature than abstract disputes about divine existence or attributes. Furthermore, Hume's critique had broader implications for how we assess the credibility of historical events and the rational standards by which we judge any claim. He articulated general principles for evaluating extraordinary assertions, principles that apply far beyond religious contexts. When a statement challenges well-established empirical knowledge, it must be evaluated by examining both the trustworthiness of those making the claim and the strength of the scientific understanding it seeks to overturn. The more implausible the assertion, the greater the demand for strong corroborative evidence. Crucially, Hume contended that no amount of witness testimony is sufficient to justify belief in a claim that directly contradicts robust and well-verified scientific principles. This evaluative framework has since become a foundational tool in both scientific methodology and critical thinking education. It provides a disciplined means of distinguishing legitimate findings from speculation or deliberate misinformation. As a result, Hume's examination of miracles not only transformed religious philosophy, but also made a lasting contribution to the broader discourse on empirical inquiry and evidentiary standards. The philosophical impact of Hume's position continues to spark debate among academics, theologians, and scientists alike. Some critics argue that Hume's reasoning presupposes the absolute constancy of natural laws, thereby rejecting miracles outright without allowing for their possibility. Others defend him, asserting that he applies a fair and uniform standard of empirical evaluation across all claims, irrespective of their religious or secular nature. In response to his critique, various religious thinkers have moved toward expressions of faith that do not rely on miraculous events, while others have reinterpreted the concept of miracles in ways that seek to bypass Hume's objections. Even today, discussions at the intersection of science and religion grapple with the core issues Hume identified, especially the challenge of balancing empirical evidence with claims of the supernatural, and the broader question of how to integrate natural and transcendent explanations in a coherent worldview. Regardless of one's personal stance on religious matters, Hume's analysis of miracle claims remains a model of philosophical precision and logical rigor. It highlights the importance of holding all empirical claims, no matter how culturally or spiritually meaningful, to consistent and rational standards of evaluation. His perspective has deeply influenced how educated individuals think about the nature of belief, the role of evidence, and the criteria by which we distinguish truth from illusion, extending far beyond the sphere of religious debate into the heart of modern intellectual life. Part 4. The Empirical Revolution. David Hume launched a transformative movement in philosophy with a single yet profoundly influential idea, that all knowledge originates in sensory experience. While this concept, known as empiricism, might appear obvious at first glance, Hume pursued its implications with unmatched rigor, revealing consequences that few had imagined. Hume's central claim asserts that if all human understanding stems from the senses, then our intellectual reach is more limited and more fascinating than philosophers had previously assumed. To grasp Hume's insight, consider a simple act of perception. When you look at what you believe is a red apple sitting on a wooden table, your eyes don't directly perceive the apple itself. Instead, they detect light waves bouncing off the surface of various objects. These waves trigger chemical reactions in your retina, which then send electrical signals via the optic nerve to your brain. Your brain interprets these signals, resulting in your experience of seeing the apple. Here's the critical point Hume makes. You never directly access the apple. only your brain's interpretation of sensory stimuli. If an external object exists at all, it lies permanently behind a veil of perception. What we call reality is always filtered through the senses, never encountered in its pure form. This led Hume to draw a crucial distinction between two types of mental content. He referred to our immediate, vivid sensory experiences as impressions. In contrast, when we later recall or imagine those experiences, we generate ideas, which are fainter, less intense echoes of the original impressions. Seeing a rose under bright sunlight gives you a powerful impression. Remembering that rose, or picturing one in your mind, produces a subtler idea. From this, Hume developed what came to be known as the copy theory of ideas. Every idea, no matter how complex or abstract, must ultimately derive from earlier sensory impressions. This foundational theory would become the cornerstone of his broader exploration into how the human mind functions. The implications of this idea were immediate and wide-ranging. If every idea must originate in experience, then concepts that can't be traced back to sensory input are either unclear or completely empty. Consider the notion of a perfectly infinite God. While we may have impressions of kindness, strength, or wisdom, we have no sensory experience of infinite perfection. Similarly, we've never directly perceived such things as a substance, a soul, or an inherent causal necessity linking events. To Hume, these concepts were either meaningless abstractions or misleading constructions formed by blending simpler ideas without evidence or rationale. This line of reasoning reshaped how thinkers approached the relationship between language and reality. Rather than assuming that every meaningful word corresponds to something real in the world, Hume insisted that each concept must be validated by tracing it back to actual experience. Terms like essence, substance, or absolute truth might sound profound, but if they can't be anchored in sense experience, they reflect linguistic confusion more than they reveal anything about the nature of reality. This realization had a lasting impact on future philosophy, encouraging many to shift away from speculative metaphysics and toward precise analysis of how we use language and form concepts. Hume also made a significant contribution to our understanding of how thoughts are linked within the mind. He proposed 3 core principles of association, which explain how one idea leads naturally to another in our thinking. The first principle is resemblance. When we think of one thing, similar things often come to mind. A photo of a loved one, for instance, immediately recalls that person due to the likeness between image and memory. The second is contiguity in time and space. We associate things that occur close together, like linking thunder with lightning, because we often experience them in tandem. The third principle is cause and effect. We connect ideas based on patterns of influence observed in the world. The scent of smoke brings fire to mind because repeated experience has taught us that one typically signals the presence of the other. The principles of association revealed a profound insight into the workings of the human mind. Much of what we consider deliberate reasoning is actually guided by automatic psychological mechanisms. These mechanisms instinctively link our thoughts through patterns formed by experience. We don't consciously choose to connect thunder with lightning or fire with smoke. Such associations emerge spontaneously, shaped by the history of our perceptions. This understanding led to a more fundamental notion. Human cognition follows its own internal psychological principles, much like the physical universe adheres to natural laws. Identifying and deciphering these principles became a cornerstone of Hume's effort to develop a systematic science of human nature, one that could stand alongside the empirical rigor of disciplines like physics and chemistry. Grounded in this empirical approach, Hume put forth a bold and unsettling conclusion about the limits of human reason. If all knowledge is rooted in sensory experience, then anything beyond the reach of the senses must remain inaccessible to us. We cannot confirm whether our perceptions correspond to real external objects, whether a reality exists independently of our minds, or whether other people experience consciousness in the same way we do. What we can directly access is limited to the contents of our own awareness, the continuous flow of sensations and thoughts that constitute our inner world. This viewpoint, later termed phenomenalism, asserted that philosophy should focus on analyzing the structure and dynamics of subjective experience, rather than making conjectures about an external world that lies beyond our perceptual reach. Though humble in appearance, this perspective would go on to reshape the course of intellectual history, inspiring generations of philosophers to explore the intricate relationship between consciousness and reality. Part 5. The Problem of Induction. David Hume exposed a deep and troubling flaw at the center of human reasoning, one so significant that it has challenged the foundations of knowledge and scientific inquiry for nearly 3 centuries. His insight strikes at the very way we interpret the world, raising unsettling questions about the trustworthiness of everything we believe we understand. The essence of this dilemma lies in a mental habit so ingrained that we rarely question it, our tendency to assume that future events will mirror past experiences. We rely on this type of reasoning instinctively, both in science and in everyday life. Yet Hume revealed that this common-sense practice rests on surprisingly fragile ground. Consider the widely held belief that the sun will rise tomorrow. It seems perfectly rational to expect this, given the uninterrupted record of sunrises throughout human history. Each day, the sun has appeared without fail, and this regularity has been observed billions of times over countless generations. From this immense body of experience, we naturally conclude that the same pattern will continue. But Hume posed a deceptively simple question. What logical basis do we truly have for expecting the future to resemble the past? At first, the question might seem trivial. Of course, the future will be like the past. That's just how reality works, isn't it? But Hume pressed further and showed that this assumption cannot be supported by either pure logic or empirical evidence. Logical reasoning provides no help, because there's nothing contradictory or illogical in imagining a world where natural laws suddenly behave differently. In purely logical terms, it is entirely possible to conceive of the sun not rising tomorrow, of gravity ceasing to function, or of fire failing to burn wood. These scenarios may appear bizarre or unlikely, but they do not violate any logical principles in the way that self-contradictory statements, like a square circle or a married bachelor, do. So perhaps we might turn to experience instead. The natural world has proven consistent over time, so wouldn't it make sense to trust in that stability? Yet Hume exposed a hidden flaw in this line of thought. Using past experience to justify future expectations already assumes that the future will continue to follow the same patterns. In doing so, we're assuming what we set out to prove. This is a classic case of circular reasoning. It's like verifying the accuracy of a measuring stick by comparing it only to itself. It tells us nothing new and offers no independent validation. The reasoning simply loops back to its own starting point. This challenge becomes especially serious when applied to scientific reasoning. The scientific method depends heavily on induction, the process of forming general principles from particular observations. When a scientist sees that two objects fall at the same speed, despite having different weights, she may conclude a universal principle about gravity. But this generalization is not deductively certain. There's no logical rule ensuring that gravity must behave tomorrow as it does today. If we cannot justify that assumption, then the entire structure of empirical science begins to wobble. Hume revealed a sobering insight. Scientific knowledge ultimately relies on an unprovable assumption that the laws of nature will remain consistent. In response to this, Hume introduced a vital distinction between two kinds of knowledge. First, there are relations of ideas, statements that are necessarily true because of the logical relationships between concepts, like mathematical truths or definitions. For instance, the claim that all bachelors are unmarried is guaranteed by the meaning of the words alone. These kinds of truths are certain and can be known through reason without reference to the external world. However, these truths tell us nothing about how the world actually works. They exist purely in the realm of thought. On the other hand, matters of fact refer to empirical claims about the world. Statements like, "The sun will rise tomorrow," or "Fire burns wood." These assertions go beyond definitions and depend on experience. Yet, as Hume demonstrated, they cannot be established through logic alone. David Hume asserted that all human reasoning about matters of fact is fundamentally rooted in our perception of cause and effect. For example, we do not predict the sunrise through deductive logic. Rather, we expect it because we believe that the Earth's rotation consistently brings about this daily event. In the same way, we assume that fire will burn wood not through direct reasoning, but because we believe that fire's inherent properties cause it to ignite flammable materials. However, Hume argued that our understanding of causation is not derived from logical analysis or innate reason. It is entirely based on experience. We never actually observe a causal connection itself. Instead, we notice certain events regularly occurring together and infer a causal relationship. This led Hume to one of his most profound philosophical conclusions, that inductive reasoning, the process of drawing general conclusions from specific observations, rests on uncertain foundations. Hume maintained that our belief that the future will resemble the past is not a product of logical inference. Rather, it emerges from repeated exposure to similar sequences of events. Through constant repetition, our minds form the expectation that the same effects will follow the same causes. This expectation, he claimed, is not grounded in rational thought, but arises from what he called custom or habit. The human mind naturally constructs expectations based on familiar patterns and recurring experiences. This tendency is not a flaw, but a core feature of how we make sense of the world, which often behaves in consistent and predictable ways. Yet, Hume identified a fundamental problem. Although this psychological mechanism is essential for navigating life, it cannot be justified through reason. Even though forming expectations is crucial for survival and practical decision-making, the process itself does not rest on any logical basis. Hume believed this realization had far-reaching implications for our understanding of knowledge and scientific inquiry. If our most foundational beliefs are shaped by unconscious mental conditioning rather than rational argument, then the entire framework of what we consider knowledge becomes more precarious than it seems. We are unable to logically prove that future occurrences will follow past patterns, yet we find ourselves psychologically incapable of believing otherwise. Nor can we definitively verify that scientific laws reveal unchanging truths about nature, even though we act as if they do with unwavering confidence. For Hume, this illustrated a deep and enduring paradox at the center of human life. We can intellectually grasp the limitations of reason, but we are not able to function solely within those limits. The conflict between philosophical doubt and everyday belief is an inescapable part of the human condition. David Hume maintained that all our judgments about matters of fact are ultimately rooted in our perception of cause and effect. Take, for example, our expectation that the sun will rise tomorrow. We don't reach this conclusion through deductive reasoning, but because we have come to associate sunrise with the Earth's rotation, a pattern we've observed repeatedly. In the same vein, we believe that fire will burn wood not through logical proof, but because we understand that the chemical nature of fire typically leads to combustion when it encounters something flammable. However, our understanding of causation does not arise from reason or rational deduction. It is derived entirely from experience. We never directly observe a causal connection itself. We only witness a constant conjunction of events, which we then interpret as having a causal link. This observation led Hume to one of his most profound insights: the inherent limitations of inductive reasoning. Hume argued that our belief in the uniformity of nature, the idea that the future will resemble the past, is not based on any logical inference. Rather, it is a psychological tendency born from repeated experience. When we see certain outcomes consistently follow specific events, our minds naturally form the expectation that this pattern will continue. This expectation is not grounded in logic, but in what Hume termed custom or habit. Human cognition is naturally predisposed to form beliefs based on recurring patterns. This is not a flaw, but an essential aspect of how we navigate and make sense of the world, a world that, more often than not, behaves in predictable ways. Yet, Hume emphasized a critical point. Although this mental process is essential to human life, it cannot be rationally justified. Even though relying on such patterns is vital for survival and practical functioning, the process by which we generate expectations lacks a logical basis. For Hume, this insight carried significant implications for epistemology and science. If our most basic beliefs are products of psychological conditioning rather than rational justification, then the foundations of knowledge are far more unstable than we tend to assume. We are unable to logically prove that future events will follow past patterns, yet we find ourselves psychologically compelled to believe they will. Similarly, although we cannot conclusively demonstrate that scientific laws represent eternal truths, we are unable to function without treating them as though they do. This, in Hume's view, exposes a deep and enduring paradox at the core of human nature. We possess the intellectual tools to recognize the limitations of our reasoning, but we are not equipped to live according to those limitations. The conflict between skeptical philosophy and everyday belief is an unresolved tension we are destined to bear. Part 6. Causation and Necessary Connection. Of all the philosophical issues David Hume tackled within his empiricist framework, none was more transformative or more unsettling than his analysis of causation. The relationship between cause and effect seems so ingrained in our experience that we rarely pause to examine it. Light a match, and it catches fire. Let go of a stone, and it falls. Touch something hot, and you recoil in pain. These everyday sequences appear so natural and unavoidable that few ever doubt their underlying logic. Yet Hume dared to probe deeper, questioning what actually takes place during such occurrences. In doing so, he exposed the idea that our understanding of causation is not derived from the external world itself, but instead shaped by the workings of the human mind. For Hume, causation reflects a mental process more than it reveals any objective feature of reality. Typically, when people think about cause and effect, they imagine a kind of unseen force linking the two events. There's a tendency to believe that the cause doesn't just come before the effect, it somehow compels it to happen, as if through some internal necessity. This everyday assumption suggests that causes inherently contain a kind of power that ensures the arrival of their effects. Hume set out to dismantle this belief by asking a straightforward yet profound question. What do we actually experience when we observe what we label a causal connection? Consider the act of striking a match and seeing it flare into flame. What do our senses truly register? We see the motion of the match against a rough surface, perhaps a few sparks, and then the appearance of fire. But do we perceive any visible or tangible force that dictates the flame must follow the strike? Through the lens of Hume's empiricism, there are only three observable features that consistently appear in events we call causal. First, there is spatial contiguity. The cause and effect occur in close physical proximity. The match and the flame are part of the same physical scene. Second, there is temporal priority. The cause always comes before the effect. The fire follows the striking motion. The third, and perhaps most significant element, is constant conjunction, the reliable pattern wherein a specific kind of cause is regularly followed by a particular effect under similar conditions. Over time, we see that matches struck in the right context typically produce flames. Yet Hume emphasized that these three elements are all that can be observed. Beyond them, our senses give us no access to any deeper connection. What we never directly perceive, no matter how closely we analyze these sequences, is what Hume called necessary connection, the supposed internal force that guarantees the effect's emergence. Even with repeated exposure to the same chain of events, we do not observe any metaphysical link flowing from cause to effect. We witness repeated patterns, but never the necessity many assume is inherent in those patterns. From this, Hume concluded that the idea of necessary connection is not grounded in any empirical evidence. Since it does not arise from what we actually observe, it cannot be included in any framework of knowledge based on experience. Rather than reflecting something built into the fabric of the world, the belief in necessity stems from psychological conditioning, a product of habit and repetition. When we insist that striking a match must result in a flame, We are projecting our mental expectation onto the world, not describing an objective truth. This realization prompted Hume to redefine causation entirely. He rejected the notion of it being an invisible force at work behind the scenes. Instead, he described causation as nothing more than the observed regularity of one event consistently following another. A cause, in his terms, is simply something that precedes, is nearby, and is habitually connected to an effect. There is no hidden mechanism or metaphysical necessity that binds the two. In Hume's view, what we label as causation is not a feature of the world in itself, but a conceptual tool we use to make sense of repeated experiences. Thus, he moved the concept of causation from the realm of objective reality into the realm of subjective interpretation, an organizing principle created by the human mind to manage and predict the flow of sensory information. Part 7. The Critique of Reason. David Hume delivered what is widely considered one of the most incisive and far-reaching examinations of human reason in philosophical history. In contrast to earlier thinkers who often accepted the authority of reason without question, Hume subjected it to a careful and uncompromising analysis, aiming to uncover what reason can truly achieve when freed from baseless presuppositions. Through this inquiry, Hume revealed that the scope of reason is significantly narrower than had long been presumed. At the same time, he acknowledged that human beings possess additional mental faculties that enable them to function competently in the world, even in the absence of rational certainty. This recognition fundamentally altered how later philosophers approached the relationship between rationality, belief, and human action. Hume distinguished between two primary forms of reasoning. The first, which he called demonstrative reasoning, is concerned with the logical relationships between abstract ideas. This form of reasoning can lead to conclusions that are necessarily true, so long as the initial premises are accepted. Mathematics exemplifies this type of thinking, where conclusions follow inevitably from clearly defined terms and principles, and any denial of these conclusions would lead to contradiction. For example, when we demonstrate that the sum of a triangle's internal angles is 180 degrees, we are not uncovering a truth about the external world, but about the logical consequences of how we define the terms triangle and angle. This kind of reasoning is flawless within its own domain, yet its reach does not extend beyond the realm of conceptual definitions. It cannot tell us anything about empirical reality. In essence, demonstrative reasoning reveals what must logically follow from certain assumptions, but it lacks the capacity to verify whether those assumptions, and the entities they refer to, actually correspond to anything in the real world. The second form, which Hume referred to as probable reasoning, deals with matters of fact and draws conclusions from empirical observation. This type of reasoning forms the basis of scientific inquiry, historical interpretation, and daily decision-making. Whether we are forecasting the weather using past climate patterns or relying on medical treatments grounded in clinical research, we are employing probable reasoning. Nevertheless, Hume showed that probable reasoning can never attain the level of certainty that demonstrative reasoning does. It invariably involves drawing conclusions that surpass the immediate evidence. Any inference about unobserved events relies on the assumption that the course of nature is uniform, that future events will mirror past experiences, a principle that itself cannot be validated through logic or direct experience. Consequently, probable reasoning is rooted not in demonstrable proof, but in psychological tendencies shaped by repeated exposure to certain patterns. From this, Hume drew a striking and disquieting conclusion. While reason may offer certainty in the abstract world of ideas, it falls short in delivering certainty about the empirical world. Our understanding of physical reality, ranging from external objects and other minds to memory and the notion of a stable self, ultimately rests on beliefs that cannot be logically proven. These beliefs arise instead from innate features of human psychology. Therefore, Hume contended that the capacity of reason has been greatly overestimated. Even so, he insisted that the mind is equipped with other faculties that allow us to navigate life effectively, despite reason's inherent limitations. A key objective of Hume's larger philosophical project was to investigate and explain these non-rational components of human nature. He sought to construct a theory of the mind grounded in how people actually think, feel, and behave. One area of particular focus for Hume was the nature of belief and how it relates to evidence. He argued that belief is not simply an intellectual endorsement of a proposition. Instead, it involves a specific mental disposition or feeling that separates it from mere imagination or theoretical supposition. When a person believes that it is raining, they do more than just understand the words, "it is raining." They adopt a certain psychological attitude toward that statement, one that marks it as believed rather than merely contemplated. Importantly, this attitude does not arise from reason alone. It is shaped by a variety of psychological elements, including the intensity of sensory experience, the credibility of memory, and the habits formed through repeated exposure to similar situations. Belief, in its essence, stems more from the internal processes of the mind than from the rigid framework of logical deduction. It is born from emotional impulses and instinctive inclinations, often operating independently of deliberate, conscious thought. Recognizing this leads to the conclusion that a genuine understanding of human knowledge requires an exploration of the psychological underpinnings that drive it, rather than relying solely on abstract reasoning or formal logic. The shortcomings of rationality become particularly apparent when we consider its role in motivating human behavior. Classical philosophy often held that reason could both shape our beliefs and direct our actions. Many ethicists argued that through rational reflection, one could discern objective moral truths, principles so self-evident that anyone who fully grasped them would feel compelled to act in accordance with them. David Hume, however, strongly opposed this position. He argued that reason, on its own, lacks the power to motivate any action. While it can uncover logical relations and help identify the most effective means to achieve a particular end, it cannot determine what ends are worth pursuing in the first place. It is our emotions, our passions, desires, and sentiments that generate the motivational energy required for action, providing both the impetus and the direction for human behavior. From this standpoint, Hume developed one of his most famous claims about the relationship between reason and emotion. He famously declared that reason is, and should only ever be, the servant of the passions. Its function is not to dictate our goals, but to help achieve those set by our emotional drives. With this vivid analogy, Hume portrayed reason as a subordinate instrument, valuable not as a source of values or purposes, but as a means of realizing the aims dictated by our emotional constitution. Reason, then, can help evaluate the coherence of our beliefs and anticipate the likely consequences of our actions. Yet it remains incapable of defining the ultimate aims or values that guide our lives. This utilitarian view of reason directly contradicted the traditional philosophical ideal that celebrated rationality as humanity's highest faculty and the supreme pathway to truth. Hume's critique reached beyond morality and human conduct, extending to the presumed capacity of reason to uncover religious and metaphysical truths. For generations, philosophers had maintained that reason alone could prove the existence of God, the soul's immortality, and the fundamental structure of reality, all without appealing to sensory experience. But when Hume applied his empirical philosophy to these long-standing claims, he found their foundations lacking. He noted that many such arguments rested on concepts disconnected from any observable experience or involved faulty reasoning. For instance, the cosmological argument asserts that every effect must have a cause, yet inexplicably exempts God from this principle. Similarly, the ontological argument seeks to establish existence purely from definitions, an approach Hume rejected, since existence, he argued, cannot be logically derived from a mere idea. For Hume, these arguments fail not necessarily because their conclusions are wrong, but because they exceed the proper limits of reason, venturing into speculative territory where neither empirical evidence nor sound inference can support them. Despite this broad critique of reason's reach, Hume did not fall into complete skepticism or endorse irrationality. He recognized that no one can genuinely live by the extreme doubts that philosophical skepticism might suggest. Even the most questioning mind continues to accept the existence of the external world, to trust memory, and to expect that the future will resemble the past in the ordinary course of life. This insight led Hume to the view that, while philosophical skepticism reveals the constraints of reason's ability to justify belief, it does not undermine the natural convictions that govern human existence. His response to this dilemma was not despair, but a call for measured intellectual humility. We ought to value the capabilities of reason without inflating its authority. Rational inquiry remains essential, but we must also acknowledge that certain questions may lie beyond its scope. For Hume, this balanced perspective, recognizing the utility of reason while accepting its limits, was crucial for attaining both philosophical insight and practical wisdom. Part 8. Political Philosophy and the Science of Government. David Hume approached political theory with the same empirical mindset he brought to all facets of human inquiry. He regarded governments and political structures not as ideal constructs, but as natural extensions of human behavior, developments that could be systematically studied through observation and analysis. Rather than basing his political philosophy on abstract principles like natural rights, social contracts, or utopian visions of governance, Hume concentrated on how political institutions actually emerge and function in real societies. His ideas were grounded in the belief that political systems must reflect the psychological realities of human nature, rather than expecting people to rise above their emotional and cognitive limitations for the sake of civic virtue. This practical orientation reshaped how we think about constitutional design, the limits of state authority, and the interplay between individual liberty and societal order. Hume openly challenged the prevailing Enlightenment view that legitimate government must be founded upon the explicit consent of the governed, typically imagined as a foundational social contract. His historical investigations revealed that most political regimes did not originate from voluntary agreements among free and equal individuals. Instead, they often arose through conquest, the gradual evolution of social customs, or pragmatic responses to historical circumstances. In reality, people are usually born into pre-existing political systems and are subject to institutions that existed long before them and will likely persist long after them. For Hume, the notion of a social contract was a convenient myth, an invented origin story that failed to account for the actual roots of political legitimacy or why people submit to authority. To genuinely understand why citizens obey political authority, Hume argued, we must turn our attention to the psychological and cultural forces that shape collective behavior, rather than searching for fictional moments of universal agreement. This emphasis on history and psychology formed the foundation of Hume's political philosophy. Hume maintained that the obligation to obey government does not derive from any formal or explicit consent, but from shared societal conventions and the broader principle of utility. These same principles underlie other socially constructed moral norms, such as justice or promise-keeping. People come to accept the legitimacy of political authority not because they have entered into a rational agreement, but because they recognize, often through experience, that stable governance is more conducive to their well-being than anarchy or chaos. This realization does not stem from abstract reasoning, but emerges as individuals witness the concrete benefits of orderly institutions and consistent legal systems. In Hume's view, political legitimacy is earned not through theoretical justifications, but through the practical performance of government. A state gains the trust and support of its people when it reliably promotes social welfare and maintains public order, not because it conforms to idealized models, but because it proves effective. His utilitarian approach emphasized that the true test of any political system lies in its ability to enhance human flourishing more successfully than the alternatives. Through his exploration of political psychology, Hume shed light on the conditions necessary for institutional durability and functional governance. He identified public opinion as the ultimate foundation of political power, arguing that authority is upheld not primarily by force or legal mandate, but by the beliefs and attitudes of the populace. No regime, however powerful, can survive without the ongoing habitual support of those it governs. Even the institutions charged with enforcing state authority, such as the police and military, are composed of individuals whose commitment depends on their own judgments about the government's legitimacy and competence. To truly grasp the nature of political stability, one must look past the surface of legal frameworks or the mere control of force. The deeper issue lies in how public opinion is cultivated and reshaped across generations. Successful governments are those that create a psychological climate where citizens willingly accept and adhere to authority, not simply out of fear of punishment, but from a deeper, internalized sense of legitimacy. David Hume emphasized the foundational role of opinion in maintaining political power. He differentiated between types of public opinion, each serving a unique function in legitimizing authority. The first, which he called the opinion of interest, refers to the widespread belief that government institutions effectively address the population's practical needs, such as maintaining order, protecting property rights, and promoting economic well-being. When the public comes to see their everyday interests as best served by the current political system, they develop lasting habits of obedience. This ingrained compliance, rooted in perceived self-interest, forms the psychological core of stable political authority. The second type, the opinion of right, concerns citizens' moral judgment of the political order, specifically whether the system is just and power is distributed fairly. A government may perform well materially, yet still face opposition if it is viewed as unjust or ethically illegitimate by the prevailing moral standards. Therefore, a stable regime must not only deliver practical benefits, but also resonate with citizens' deeply held values and shared principles of justice and procedural fairness. Hume's empirical approach to political philosophy led him to important conclusions about constitutional structure and institutional functionality. He argued that the most enduring governments are not those that depend on rare moral excellence or exceptional rationality among leaders, but those that align their structures with the natural tendencies of human psychology. From this standpoint, political systems should be designed with the assumption that individuals are primarily motivated by self-interest, rather than idealistic virtue. Well-crafted institutions redirect this self-interest toward outcomes that serve the public good. Such a design highlights the importance of mechanisms like checks and balances, separation of powers, and other constitutional safeguards that help prevent the centralization of power, which could otherwise result in corruption or despotism. According to Hume, the effectiveness of a political system relies more heavily on the integrity of its design than on the personal character of its leaders, though the latter still matters. A regime that places its faith chiefly in the virtue of individuals remains vulnerable, as there is no guarantee that future leaders will uphold the same ethical standards or commitment to the public interest. These insights into institutional structure also shaped Hume's broader evaluation of different forms of government and informed his predictions about their future development. He was particularly interested in the English constitutional arrangement, which he regarded as a compelling example of how a monarchy could gradually evolve into a freer and more democratic form of governance, without necessitating violent revolution or complete constitutional overhaul. In Hume's assessment, the English model had succeeded in capturing many of the advantages associated with democracy. It achieved this by placing meaningful limits on royal authority, protecting individual rights, and preserving political stability, all while maintaining continuity with national traditions. However, Hume also cautioned that institutional designs which prove effective in one historical moment may lose their viability as social and economic conditions change. For political institutions to remain effective and legitimate, they must walk a fine line between structural durability and the ability to adapt. The central challenge of constitutional design, then, is to maintain this delicate equilibrium, preserving the fundamental purposes that justify a political system's existence, while retaining the flexibility to evolve in response to shifting circumstances. This ongoing tension between preserving institutional stability and allowing for meaningful reform lies at the very heart of sustaining political success over time. David Hume's political philosophy delved deeply into the essential tensions between state authority and individual liberty, as well as the pursuit of social order. He firmly rejected the extremes of political theory, both the call for all-encompassing government control and the push for such limited state involvement that society would become incapable of functioning effectively. In Hume's view, government serves a vital function in upholding justice, securing property rights, providing public services, and resolving conflicts that could otherwise lead to instability. Yet, he was equally aware that political power, if not constrained, can devolve into tyranny and abuse. To prevent such outcomes, Hume emphasized the importance of well-structured institutions and clearly articulated constitutional limitations. He argued that identifying the proper role of government should be grounded in empirical observation. This means assessing, through practical experience, which societal needs can be satisfied through voluntary cooperation and which necessitate enforceable, centralized authority. According to Hume, these assessments are not universally applicable. They differ from one society to another, shaped by distinct historical experiences, cultural values, and economic realities. This pragmatic and observation-based method became a cornerstone of Hume's long-standing influence on political thought. Thinkers seeking a balanced alternative to both radical upheaval and blind adherence to tradition often turned to Hume's moderate stance, which favored careful incremental reforms to political institutions. His skepticism of overly idealistic political blueprints, paired with a keen awareness of unintended consequences, helped establish the foundational principles of modern political liberalism. Hume's work also played a formative role in the development of constitutional democracy. By examining the psychological underpinnings of political authority and emphasizing the significance of public opinion, he laid early groundwork for the disciplines of political science and democratic theory. Contemporary discussions surrounding institutional design, the justification of political authority, and the interplay between individual freedoms and the public good still reflect Hume's foundational insights. Through his detailed exploration of political structures and behavior, Hume offered a lens through which to understand how governments function in practice, not just in theory. His trailblazing approach to analyzing governance through empirical evidence continues to provide essential direction for modern political analysis and institutional reform. Part 9. Taste, Beauty, and the Foundations of Aesthetic Judgment. David Hume's investigation into aesthetics revealed a familiar philosophical tension, the conflict between individual perception and claims to universal validity. This echoes the same dilemma he encountered in his discussions of moral feeling and rational belief. When analyzing beauty, taste, and the value of art, Hume remained grounded in his empirical approach, focusing on how people actually form judgments rather than attempting to deduce them from abstract principles or universal ideals. Instead of theorizing about some ideal form of beauty, Hume turned his attention to real-life aesthetic experiences and how individuals respond to art. His account of aesthetic judgment became one of the most influential frameworks in modern aesthetics. He argued that while our reactions to art are deeply emotional and personal, they can still give rise to widely accepted standards for evaluating artistic worth, without assuming that beauty exists as an objective property in the external world. This empirical approach played a key role in shaping modern thought about how personal taste operates within broader cultural norms for artistic excellence. By examining his own responses to art and encouraging others to reflect on theirs, Hume uncovered a distinctive kind of emotional engagement central to aesthetic evaluation. This kind of experience, while pleasurable, is unlike mere sensory enjoyment or moral satisfaction. Beauty, as Hume saw it, arises when something moves us in a uniquely pleasing way. But this response goes beyond simply saying, "I like it." When someone calls a painting beautiful or a symphony extraordinary, they are doing more than expressing private preference. They are making a kind of claim that others, if similarly perceptive and attentive, should arrive at the same conclusion. For Hume, aesthetic judgment depends on what he called the sentiment of taste, an emotional reaction that is both personal and implicitly invites agreement from others. This sentiment is personal because it originates in feeling rather than rational deduction, but it also has an intersubjective dimension, as it assumes that others with comparable sensibilities might respond in the same way. Understanding this dual character, at once emotional and socially communicative, is key to grasping Hume's view of how judgments about art and beauty function. However, Hume was fully aware of the complications introduced by profound disagreements in matters of taste. What delights one person may repel another, and these differences are only magnified by the diversity of artistic traditions across cultures. If aesthetic judgment is based solely on individual feeling with no objective grounding, it seems that all artistic opinions are equally valid, and any attempt to argue about artistic quality becomes meaningless. This possibility threatens to undermine the very basis of art criticism, education in the arts, and the existence of shared standards for evaluating creative achievement. Hume aimed to steer between two problematic extremes. On one hand, a relativism that treats every aesthetic opinion as equally legitimate, and on the other, a rigid objectivism that sees taste as determined by fixed features of the artwork itself. To resolve this, Hume proposed identifying the optimal conditions under which aesthetic judgment operates, and the characteristics that define a more cultivated or discerning taste. He argued that certain psychological conditions allow for better, more refined aesthetic evaluations. Although taste always involves subjective feeling, not everyone is equally capable of forming reliable or insightful judgments about art. Some individuals, thanks to particular traits, make more trustworthy assessments than others. Among these traits are a delicacy of sentiment that allows for sensitivity to subtle artistic nuances, extensive exposure to a variety of artistic forms and styles, an impartial mindset that resists personal biases, solid reasoning skills to help discern aesthetic relationships, and regular practice in engaging with high-quality artworks, which sharpens perception over time. Those who exhibit these qualities in abundance, Hume identified as true judges, people whose evaluations carry the most weight in determining artistic merit. In Hume's view, the standard of taste does not emerge from objective properties or codified rules, but from the collective judgments of these well-qualified critics. By rooting aesthetic standards in human psychology, specifically in the faculties of well-developed taste, Hume maintained that some judgments are genuinely better than others. Yet he also emphasized that these standards are not absolute or external, but are grounded in the capacities and experiences of human beings themselves. David Hume's reflections on aesthetic judgment led him to uncover deep insights about the connection between aesthetic experience and broader psychological processes. He noted that our enjoyment of art often arises from recognizing complex interrelations, such as the dynamic between parts and wholes, the coordination of means with ends, or the alignment of expressive elements with their intended meanings, all of which demand a high level of intellectual engagement. Take music as an example. Appreciating a composition typically depends on the listener's ability to follow evolving themes, repetitions, and variations that unfold over time. Similarly, the appeal of a painting may emerge from the subtle harmony between its colors, shapes, and subject matter, elements whose significance becomes apparent only through careful, sustained observation. This highlights that aesthetic judgment involves more than just emotional reaction. It also draws upon our cognitive abilities, which help deepen and refine our emotional responses. Consequently, a well-rounded aesthetic education must cultivate not only a sensitivity to beauty, but also an informed understanding of artistic techniques and historical context. The most discerning aesthetic responses blend an immediate emotional connection with a cultivated awareness of how artistic forms elicit such reactions. Beyond the psychological dimension, Hume also examined the social and cultural influences on aesthetic judgment. He acknowledged that individual taste does not develop in isolation, but is shaped within the context of a cultural tradition that supplies role models of artistic excellence, shared critical vocabularies, and collective reinforcement of aesthetic norms. Different cultures may uphold different ideals of beauty and give rise to distinctive artistic traditions. Yet, for Hume, this cultural variety does not necessarily lead to full-blown relativism. Diverging aesthetic preferences might represent valid alternative ways of engaging with beauty, or they might reflect varying degrees of artistic sophistication or cultural advancement. Distinguishing between these possibilities requires empirical investigation into the conditions that foster aesthetic refinement, rather than assuming that all artistic expressions are equal or that any single tradition possesses a monopoly on aesthetic value. Hume's thinking in this area anticipated later developments in anthropology and sociology, particularly in their examinations of how cultural forces shape artistic meaning and aesthetic standards. His work laid the foundation for understanding art as a socially embedded phenomenon, without dismissing the legitimacy of critical evaluation. The implications of Hume's aesthetic theory extend into fields such as art criticism, cultural institutions, and arts education. If aesthetic standards rest on the cultivated perceptions of experienced critics rather than fixed universal laws, then the role of criticism should be to foster the development of refined taste, not to impose abstract theoretical frameworks. In this light, critics must possess the psychological depth necessary to make sound aesthetic judgments, while remaining open to novel forms of artistic expression that challenge prevailing categories. Similarly, arts education should emphasize the gradual cultivation of perceptiveness and emotional sensitivity toward significant works of art, rather than focusing on the rote memorization of theoretical concepts. Institutions like museums, schools, and arts organizations have a crucial part to play in this educational endeavor. Their mission should be to create opportunities for individuals to directly engage with high-quality artworks, encouraging the growth of personal aesthetic awareness while grounding it in established artistic traditions. This approach prioritizes experiential learning and the progressive refinement of critical faculties. Hume also explored the relationship between aesthetic values and other domains of human value, particularly the moral. He argued that both aesthetic and moral judgments arise from sentiment rather than abstract reasoning, but each adheres to distinct principles and serves different human purposes, even though both aim at forms of shared, intersubjective understanding. The merit of a work of art lies in its capacity to generate appropriate aesthetic pleasure in discerning viewers, while moral worth depends on behaviors and attitudes that promote human flourishing and social cohesion. As a result, aesthetic and moral judgments may occasionally diverge. For instance, when a work of exceptional artistic power portrays morally disturbing themes, or when morally admirable acts lack aesthetic resonance. Understanding such complexities is essential for grasping the broader role of art in human life, and for clarifying how aesthetic and moral education should complement one another. Hume maintained that aesthetic experience plays a vital and irreplaceable role in human well-being, one that cannot be fully explained by ethical, political, or utilitarian considerations. It provides a distinct mode of engaging with the world, one that enriches our lives in ways that transcend mere functionality or moral instruction. David Hume's influence on aesthetic philosophy endures well beyond the context of the 18th century, continuing to shape contemporary debates around artistic evaluation, cultural discourse, and the educational role of aesthetics. His concept of the standard of taste was instrumental in the historical development of art criticism and cultural theory, and his inquiry into the nature of aesthetic judgment has left a profound mark on both philosophical reflection and psychological research into aesthetic experience. Today, conversations about aesthetic relativism, cultural appropriation, and the formation of artistic canons still grapple with the foundational issues Hume examined in his analysis of aesthetic perception. His emphasis on the psychological dimensions of aesthetic judgment, as well as his recognition that aesthetic standards are shaped by social context rather than grounded in absolute objective criteria, anticipated many of the theoretical frameworks employed in modern aesthetics. These frameworks underscore the importance of understanding aesthetic experience as an inherent human capacity that is cultivated through cultural participation and social interaction. In this light, Hume's aesthetic philosophy remains highly pertinent for those interested in how aesthetic judgments actually emerge within real-world contexts, rather than how they ought to function according to abstract or idealized norms. His work continues to provide valuable insights for both scholars and practitioners engaged in the interpretation, evaluation, and critique of the arts. Part 10. The Historian and the Science of Human Nature. David Hume's turn to historical writing was not a break from his philosophical pursuits, but rather a natural progression of his empirical approach, applied to the broad tapestry of human behavior throughout history. His ambitious History of England, a work that consumed much of his later life, brought him significantly more fame in his own time than his philosophical publications ever did. This extensive historical undertaking reflected Hume's enduring interest in human nature, explored through a detailed analysis of how people act in different historical and societal contexts. Hume did not set out to produce a conventional chronicle of past events. Instead, he sought to uncover the underlying psychological and social principles that drive human behavior. By identifying patterns that recurred across diverse eras and cultures, he aimed to expose the fundamental laws governing human actions. In this way, Hume helped pioneer a new vision of history, not merely as a record of events, but as a field capable of generating scientific insights into the nature of individuals and societies. Departing from traditional historical narratives that emphasized heroic figures, military exploits, and political landmarks, Hume shifted focus to the deeper causes behind historical developments. He was particularly interested in the beliefs, institutions, customs, and material conditions that shaped the mindset and choices of ordinary people. His method emphasized a psychological reading of history, an effort to understand the internal dispositions of historical agents rather than simply recount external happenings. Despite the wide variation in cultural norms and historical circumstances, Hume held that all human beings shared certain core psychological characteristics. These universal traits, he believed, led to predictable responses when individuals encountered similar social or psychological pressures. Thus, for Hume, a genuine understanding of historical change required the identification of the mechanisms, both psychological and societal, that connected specific contexts with particular patterns of behavior. It was through this interpretive framework that Hume redefined history as a crucial means of investigating human nature, rather than a mere collection of moral tales or entertaining stories. The theoretical foundation of Hume's historical methodology rested firmly on his earlier philosophical work, particularly his theories of causation and induction within the natural sciences. Just as science aims to discover consistent regularities in the physical world to enable explanation and prediction, Hume believed that historical inquiry could reveal enduring patterns in human conduct, advancing our knowledge of social and political life. Still, he was fully aware that studying human beings presented complexities absent from the natural sciences. Unlike inanimate objects, human actions are shaped by consciousness, intention, and cultural influences, making their causal pathways far more intricate. People act based on their beliefs and values, yet those beliefs and values are themselves shaped by historical traditions and social environments that evolve over time. Therefore, any attempt to explain historical events must account for both the internal psychological motivations of individuals and the broader social forces that mold collective thought and institutional structures. Hume's historical method consistently emphasized this dual perspective, attending equally to the individual mind and the collective dynamics of society. Through his historical analysis, Hume traced long-term developments in political institutions that echoed his philosophical reflections on governance and authority. In charting the rise of constitutional government in England, he followed its roots from feudal systems through the seismic shifts of the 17th century. His account made clear that political evolution stemmed not from abstract ideals, but from the interplay between constant human desires and changing social conditions. For Hume, transformations like the rise of parliamentary authority, the expansion of legal rights, and the imposition of limits on royal power emerged as practical responses to immediate political needs, not as applications of lofty political theory. Political leaders operated under specific constraints and responded to distinct challenges, yet their underlying motivations, such as the pursuit of security, economic advantage, and social prestige, remained fundamentally the same across different epochs. These shared incentives gave rise to recurring patterns of political behavior. By recognizing these patterns, Hume was able to explain why certain reforms succeeded where others failed, and why some societies developed more robust political systems than their counterparts. His work showed that history, when examined through the combined lenses of psychology and empirical observation, could yield deep insights into the forces that drive social and political progress. Hume's historical investigations provided strong support for his philosophical view that political authority is not a natural or divinely ordained phenomenon, but rather a social convention. His work emphasized the essential role that well-crafted institutional frameworks play in fostering long-term political order and effectiveness. Delving into the evolution of religious and intellectual traditions, Hume further examined the interplay between reason, belief, and societal forces. His studies traced the spread and transformation of philosophical and religious doctrines across different cultures, revealing the psychological dispositions and social contexts that give rise to such beliefs and influence their development. Religious and philosophical movements often flourish not because of their logical coherence, but because they address deep-seated emotional needs, reflect prevailing cultural values, or align with the agendas of influential social groups. Even seemingly rational milestones, like those of the scientific revolution, were shaped by complex social dynamics that cannot be fully accounted for by reason alone. Through this historical lens, Hume demonstrated the limitations of relying solely on rationalist explanations for the formation of human opinions. His analysis brought attention to the powerful roles of psychological tendencies and social environments, factors often overlooked in philosophical discourse. In doing so, he reaffirmed his skepticism about the dominance of reason, while offering a more comprehensive picture of how knowledge is formed, transmitted, and transformed. In addition, Hume's historical method underscored the central importance of economic and social conditions in driving both political and cultural evolution. He explored how changes in commerce, population structures, technology, and social organization gave rise to new needs and tensions that, in turn, demanded institutional and cultural adaptation. For example, the rise of commercial and industrial activity in early modern Europe gave birth to emerging social classes whose interests often clashed with those of agrarian elites. These developments were key drivers of constitutional change and political conflict, dynamics that cannot be understood apart from their economic foundations. Likewise, innovations in military technology and organizational capacity reshaped power dynamics within societies, creating pressures that led to the transformation of political institutions and the rise of the modern state. Hume's focus on material and structural forces foreshadowed later trends in the social sciences, where economic and technological factors became central to understanding societal change. Yet, he avoided the trap of crude economic determinism by continually recognizing the role of psychological and cultural mechanisms through which material conditions shape behavior and institutions. Beyond its scholarly value, Hume's historical approach offered practical insights for interpreting current political and social realities. Understanding the historical roots of today's institutions and norms allows for a more informed grasp of how they might evolve, as well as the conditions under which they are most likely to function effectively. Reflecting on the past also brings to light the unforeseen consequences of earlier decisions and reforms, offering lessons that can guide contemporary policy. It sheds light on the types of social and psychological contexts that have historically either advanced or hindered human flourishing, thus informing strategies to meet today's complex challenges. However, Hume was careful to note that history does not provide ready-made solutions. Each era is shaped by unique circumstances, and the unpredictability of human action means that exact replication of past successes is unattainable. Instead, Hume argued for using historical insight to discern broad patterns and recurring dynamics. The purpose is not to imitate the past mechanically, but to develop a sophisticated awareness of the conditions that tend to support or undermine successful political and social arrangements. David Hume's integration of philosophical analysis with historical investigation established a foundation for an empirically informed approach to the study of human behavior. His interdisciplinary vision played a pivotal role in shaping the development of disciplines such as psychology, sociology, political science, and economics. By demonstrating that careful observation and analytical reasoning could uncover profound truths about human nature and social organization, Hume showed that valuable insights into society do not require the experimental rigor associated with the natural sciences. Although experimentation is a central tool in the physical sciences, it is often impractical or impossible when examining the complexities of social life. In such cases, historical inquiry provides a compelling alternative, functioning as a kind of natural experiment. Different historical periods and cultural contexts can be treated as case studies that reveal how human behavior responds to varying institutional and environmental conditions. By systematically comparing these contexts, researchers can identify recurring patterns and fundamental principles that govern social behavior, while still recognizing the variability and richness of human experience. This comparative historical method became a defining feature of modern social science, offering a powerful means to investigate contemporary social and political issues. Hume's historical writings, therefore, should not be seen as a departure from his philosophical endeavors, but rather as a natural progression of them. They represent an effort to extend philosophical reasoning into the empirical study of human actions, embedded within their broader social and historical environments. Part 11. The Enduring Influence of Human Insight. Nearly 3 centuries after David Hume completed his transformative study of human nature, his philosophical contributions continue to shape the intellectual frameworks through which educated individuals understand knowledge, existence, morality, and societal structures. His thought remains deeply relevant across a wide array of academic fields and real-world practices. By systematically applying empirical inquiry to foundational philosophical issues, Hume introduced innovative methods for analyzing human experience. His work dissolved traditional barriers between philosophy, psychology, and emerging social sciences, and the fundamental questions he raised, as well as the methods he devised to explore them, remain central to contemporary thought. Because of this, Hume stands among the most impactful philosophers with practical relevance. To fully appreciate the depth of his influence, one must consider how later thinkers have drawn on, modified, and expanded his ideas to tackle enduring intellectual challenges he first approached with methodical clarity. Hume's investigation into the limits of human reason marked a turning point in discussions surrounding knowledge and reality. His contention that inductive reasoning lacks a non-circular logical basis continues to challenge scientists and philosophers striving to ground empirical knowledge on a firm foundation. Modern philosophy of science has largely accepted Hume's insight that no amount of observational data can conclusively verify a scientific theory. This understanding has led to more sophisticated approaches to scientific methodology, emphasizing hypothesis testing, falsifiability, and comparative analysis of competing theories rather than seeking absolute inductive proof. At the same time, contemporary epistemology has absorbed Hume's reflections on the psychological nature of belief, giving rise to more naturalistic approaches that examine how cognition actually works in practice, rather than prescribing how it should ideally function. Though the problem of induction remains philosophically unresolved, Hume's framework continues to guide inquiry into how empirical observations support or limit theoretical understanding. His legacy is visible not only in academic philosophy, but also in practical contexts like science education, policymaking, and the teaching of analytical reasoning, fields that must grapple with making decisions under uncertainty and partial evidence. Hume's moral philosophy has had a similarly profound and lasting effect on modern ethics. His assertion that one cannot logically deduce moral imperatives from factual statements initiated long-standing debates over the division between empirical science and normative ethics, debates that still shape fields such as bioethics, environmental responsibility, and social justice policy. By emphasizing emotional sentiment as the foundation of moral judgment rather than abstract rational principles, Hume foreshadowed the rise of moral psychology as an empirical discipline. This field now studies how individuals actually arrive at ethical decisions, in contrast to idealized models of moral reasoning. Modern research in areas such as evolutionary ethics, experimental philosophy, and effective neuroscience has confirmed and extended many of Hume's key insights into the emotional roots of moral thought, using empirical tools that were unavailable in his time. His empiricist stance on ethical questions has also informed practical disciplines like values education, conflict mediation, and the crafting of humane public policies. These approaches acknowledge the complexities of human psychology and avoid imposing rigid moral frameworks from above. The fundamental tension Hume identified between striving for moral universality and accounting for subjective human emotion remains a driving force behind interdisciplinary ethical debate. In the realm of political philosophy, Hume's legacy persists through his focus on institutional mechanisms and empirical analysis of political conduct. His insight that political legitimacy is grounded more in collective public consent than in coercive control helped to shape the development of democratic theory and laid the groundwork for modern studies of public opinion. Hume's realistic approach to political systems, favoring institutions that work with ordinary human motivations rather than depending on idealized virtue, had a direct influence on the framers of the U.S. Constitution. His ideas continue to inform contemporary discussions on democratic stability, institutional design, and governance strategies that are attuned to actual human behavior and limitations. David Hume's understanding of political legitimacy, founded not on inherent natural rights or contractual theories, but on practical utility and established conventions, continues to influence modern utilitarian approaches to political analysis and policy design. His insights into the psychological underpinnings of political life and the frequently unanticipated consequences of institutional frameworks have become deeply embedded in contemporary political science. This has encouraged a data-driven approach that emphasizes examining how institutions function in real-world settings, rather than idealizing their purpose through abstract theorizing. Hume's intellectual impact reaches well beyond theoretical discourse and into applied realms such as constitutional design, electoral systems, and the everyday workings of governance. In these practical fields, his recognition of the limits imposed by human psychology and social realities offers a valuable corrective to overly idealistic ambitions. Perhaps Hume's most lasting legacy lies not in the particular stances he adopted, but in the methodological innovations he championed. By employing empirical observation in philosophical exploration, he helped shift the discipline toward an evidence-based approach aligned with the natural and social sciences. This reorientation steered philosophy away from purely speculative reasoning and toward systematic engagement with the real world. His commitment to rooting philosophical inquiry in observable psychological and social phenomena laid the foundation for several modern disciplines. The rise of experimental psychology, empirical sociology, and anthropological field methods can all trace intellectual ancestry to Hume's approach. His belief that concepts should be studied in terms of their origins and their practical use opened pathways for contemporary areas such as conceptual analysis, the philosophy of language, and cognitive science. Moreover, Hume's integration of analytical rigor with historical perspective pioneered an interdisciplinary method that connects distinct academic domains. This approach remains vital today as complex societal issues often require multifaceted responses that cross traditional academic boundaries. His influence is still felt in both academic research and public debate, particularly in the way foundational questions about human behavior and social systems are framed and investigated. Outside the academy, Hume's philosophical contributions have shaped modern cultural thought in areas like education, civic reasoning, and personal development. His exploration of the balance between reason and emotion has significantly influenced therapeutic practices in psychology and psychiatry, promoting an approach that seeks to understand and work with emotional life rather than suppress it. His reflections on identity as a socially constructed phenomenon continue to resonate in current discussions about selfhood, cultural belonging, and the human desire for connection. In advocating for intellectual modesty and an awareness of cognitive limitations, Hume has inspired more responsible and thoughtful public discourse, one that respects evidence and reason while embracing the inherent complexity of human experience. Hume's naturalistic interpretation of moral and aesthetic judgments continues to inform how we approach cultural criticism, artistic appreciation, and ethical instruction. These perspectives prioritize nurturing our shared human faculties over enforcing strict external doctrines or authoritarian standards. The values that Hume exemplified, intellectual curiosity, moral seriousness, openness to new ideas, and a deep respect for evidence, remain guiding principles for both academic life and democratic citizenship. Most importantly, his way of approaching life's profound questions, through a combination of clear reasoning, emotional awareness, and practical wisdom, offers a model for how to engage with complexity without losing sight of what makes life meaningful. Hume demonstrated that rigorous philosophical inquiry can lead not to cynicism or detachment, but to a richer and more compassionate understanding of the human condition. By weaving together skepticism with a grounded sense of human nature, Hume showed that accepting the limits of our knowledge doesn't necessitate despair. Instead, it can coexist with a hopeful pragmatism and a sincere engagement with moral and political life. His empirical stance offers an alternative to both rigid dogmatism and aimless relativism, providing a balanced framework still highly applicable to today's ethical and political challenges. Ultimately, Hume's method of linking individual psychology with broader social and historical dynamics created a model for interpreting human behavior that avoids both extreme individualism and overgeneralized social theories. His nuanced approach continues to shape how we think about the interplay between personal agency and structural forces in shaping human action. At the core of his philosophical vision is an unwavering commitment to understanding human nature as it genuinely is, shaped by experience and observation, rather than as it is imagined through idealized philosophical traditions. This grounded approach underpins his views on both personal development and social reform, advocating for strategies that work with, rather than against, the inherent qualities of human psychology and the realities of societal structures. Though David Hume died in 1776, the questions he grappled with and the intellectual tools he developed to address them retain remarkable relevance nearly 3 centuries later. His writings stand as a testament to philosophy's greatest strength, the ability to merge abstract thought with concrete application, to pair rigorous logical reasoning with psychological depth, and to balance individual insight with an understanding of collective behavior. In today's world, still mired in ideological extremes, deepening polarization, widespread social fragmentation, and the complex interplay of scientific progress and moral uncertainty, Hume's approach to examining human nature and social organization remains profoundly instructive. His legacy reminds us that meaningful philosophical inquiry can be both intellectually rigorous and practically consequential. Perhaps his most enduring contribution lies in his demonstration that intellectual honesty, empirical attentiveness, and practical wisdom are not only compatible, but mutually enriching. When combined, these virtues expand, rather than limit, our capacity to understand ourselves and improve the human condition. Although the comprehensive science of human nature that Hume envisioned is still a work in progress, his example continues to inspire those who seek to engage with life's complexities through both critical inquiry and heartfelt empathy. Hume's significance does not stem from offering final answers to life's perennial mysteries. Instead, it lies in the path he illuminated, one defined by a thoughtful balance of rational doubt and humane insight, qualities that exemplify the highest aspirations of both reason and ethics. Part 12. Skepticism and Natural Belief. David Hume developed one of the most subtle and lasting examinations of philosophical skepticism in the Western tradition. He refused to trivialize skeptical arguments as mere linguistic puzzles, yet he also resisted succumbing to despair or inertia in the face of their implications. Instead, Hume showed that skepticism reveals essential truths about the limits of human understanding, truths that, paradoxically, have little bearing on how we actually live or think. Rather than allowing skepticism to freeze human thought or action, Hume exposed its double nature. It reveals the vulnerability of our cognitive faculties while simultaneously demonstrating how inconsequential that vulnerability is in practical life. His approach laid the groundwork for a nuanced appreciation of the relationship between abstract philosophical doubt and the instinctive operations of human psychology. In doing so, Hume arrived at a kind of equilibrium, acknowledging the power of skeptical insight while defending the innate tendencies that shape human thought and behavior. Traditionally, skeptical thinkers focused on undermining the reliability of the senses. They pointed to the ease with which perception could mislead, how visual appearances shift depending on context, how illusions and hallucinations distort reality, and how each of us is confined to a subjective viewpoint that cannot access an objective world beyond perception. From these insights, they inferred that certainty about external reality is forever out of reach. But Hume recognized a deeper vulnerability left unexamined by this classical skepticism, the unquestioned trust in the power of reason itself. While earlier skeptics critiqued sensory input, they continued to rely on rational thought as a trustworthy tool for identifying those very flaws. Hume challenged this unspoken assumption by advancing a more radical form of skepticism, one that cast doubt not only on sense perception, but also on the very legitimacy of rational inference. This more profound skepticism led Hume to interrogate the core principles of logic and mathematics. He contended that even our most basic logical and mathematical judgments are not grounded in objective certainty, but rather in psychological tendencies, habits of mind shaped by repeated experience. In Hume's view, these seemingly self-evident truths do not possess rational justification apart from the mental patterns that produce them. At the heart of Hume's deeper skepticism lay his analysis of inductive reasoning. He famously argued that all knowledge about factual matters depends on the assumption that the future will resemble the past. This expectation, which underpins not only scientific inquiry, but also everyday decisions and survival itself, cannot be supported by reason. Attempts to defend it through logic or experience result in circularity. We trust the future will mirror the past because it always has, an argument that assumes the very conclusion it seeks to prove. Consequently, even the most rigorous scientific theories and the most consistent habits of daily life rest on an unprovable belief in the uniformity of nature. We possess no rational basis to believe that the laws of logic will hold tomorrow just as they do today, or that mathematical truths will remain constant. When pursued to its logical end, Hume's skepticism compels us to recognize that most of our convictions about the world are built on assumptions that lack rational substantiation. This sweeping doubt reaches beyond our confidence in the external world. It encompasses our reliance on memory, our trust in logical reasoning, and even our belief in the continuity of personal identity. Yet Hume uncovered an unexpected insight in the midst of this philosophical darkness. The human mind cannot sustain such radical doubt indefinitely. Regardless of how persuasive skeptical arguments may be, people inevitably return to trusting their senses, relying on memory, and expecting familiar patterns to recur. Even the most reflective skeptic unconsciously depends on the very cognitive faculties they question. In fact, the act of engaging in skeptical inquiry itself assumes the validity of reason, the reliability of memory, and the existence of other minds capable of understanding and responding to philosophical claims. Thus, skepticism ultimately turns on itself. It critiques the assumptions that enable it, thereby eroding its own authority. Hume concluded that while skeptical reasoning may be intellectually formidable, it cannot overturn the deep-seated beliefs that govern human thought and conduct. Looking inward, Hume provided a strikingly personal account of the tension between doubt and instinct. Alone in his study, immersed in philosophical reflection, he could follow skeptical reasoning to its furthest conclusions, experiencing the full emotional and intellectual force of uncertainty, not only about the external world, but even about the reality of his own identity. Whenever he left his study and returned to the rhythm of everyday life, chatting with friends over dinner or playing a casual game of backgammon, his philosophical doubts would completely dissolve. In their place, an effortless and unwavering trust in the ordinary assumptions of life would naturally return. This stark contrast between intellectual skepticism and instinctive certainty revealed something essential about the structure of the human mind. While intense contemplation can momentarily unsettle our confidence in certain beliefs, it does not possess the strength to uproot the psychological forces that originally gave rise to them. Skeptical inquiry, then, appears to have only a temporary impact on belief. The foundations of natural conviction lie deeper within our cognitive framework than reflective reasoning, and they persist even when rational scrutiny questions their legitimacy. This insight led Hume to distinguish between two fundamentally distinct modes of mental operation, each governed by its own internal principles. One mode involves philosophical reasoning, which follows the rigorous demands of logic and empirical evidence, pushing arguments to their logical conclusion, regardless of their practical consequences. The other is rooted in natural belief, automatic, psychologically driven tendencies shaped by evolutionary pressures. These innate cognitive processes serve essential, pragmatic roles. They enable survival and effective interaction with the environment. Without requiring deliberate thought, they generate a baseline confidence in the world around us, in the reliability of memory, the continuity of personal identity, and the regularity of nature. Such beliefs emerge automatically and intuitively, functioning effectively even without logical validation. What is most remarkable is that these mental mechanisms remain fully operative, even in the face of philosophical critiques that expose the rational indefensibility of their assumptions. Hume saw in this psychological insight a practical response to skepticism, one that does not undermine the intellectual seriousness of skeptical challenges. These arguments shed light on critical truths about the limits of reason and highlight that our foundational beliefs rest not on logic, but on deeply embedded psychological habits. They reveal the vulnerable scaffolding beneath our knowledge and call on us to recognize the inherent constraints of human reasoning. Yet, these arguments do not obligate us to abandon our fundamental beliefs or to adopt a skeptical lifestyle. For Hume, the appropriate stance toward skepticism is not to reject belief altogether or to descend into paralyzing doubt, but to embrace a balanced form of skepticism, one that acknowledges both the insights and the limitations of skeptical inquiry. We ought to stay open to what skepticism uncovers, while still maintaining trust in the natural beliefs that allow us to live and function in the world. This balanced approach to skepticism informed Hume's wider philosophy regarding the role of philosophical reflection in ordinary life. In his view, the highest purpose of philosophy is not to replace our natural instincts with abstract theory, but to reveal essential truths about human nature and the boundaries of understanding. Philosophy, at its best, enriches our self-awareness by clarifying, not discarding, the psychological roots of belief and action. The real value of philosophical inquiry, according to Hume, lies in its ability to illuminate the workings of the human mind and to explain why we hold the convictions we do, not in attempting to construct alternative, purely rational justifications for those convictions. This naturalistic emphasis shifted the focus of philosophy toward human psychology and social experience, moving away from purely metaphysical speculation. Seen from this angle, the most important philosophical problems are not concerned with uncovering the ultimate nature of reality, but with tracing the development of human thought and the cognitive mechanisms that underpin belief. This redirection from metaphysical theorizing to psychological exploration would profoundly influence the future trajectory of philosophy, and it would help lay the groundwork for modern psychology and the social sciences. Part 13. Hume and the Bundle Theory of Mind. When David Hume applied his empiricist approach to the question of consciousness and identity, he arrived at conclusions that challenge centuries of philosophical tradition. His exploration of what gives us the feeling of being the same person over time led to a startling insight. The self, as commonly understood, is not something we can observe or verify. It is a mental construct, not a tangible reality. This discovery had significant implications not only for philosophy and psychology, but also for our broader understanding of morality, personal development, and what it means to be human. Hume's analysis of the mind stands as one of his most penetrating and enduring contributions to the study of human nature. Traditionally, both religious doctrines and philosophical systems have maintained that personal identity depends on the existence of a permanent, unchanging core, often imagined as a soul or immutable self, that provides continuity throughout the flux of life. This stable essence was thought to unify our experiences and bind our past, present, and future into a coherent whole. Debates persisted over whether this core was material or spiritual, singular or made up of parts, finite or everlasting. Nevertheless, there was widespread agreement on one point. Without such a constant self, the concept of identity would disintegrate. On this foundation rested ideas of moral responsibility, individuality, and the meaningfulness of a person's life. Hume, however, approached the issue through a purely empirical lens. He encouraged a direct, introspective look into the mind to determine whether this permanent self could actually be found. The results of his investigation, and those he urged others to replicate, were both unexpected and unsettling. Upon examining his own mind with careful attention, Hume reported finding only a continuous stream of impressions, feelings of heat or cold, sights and sounds, emotions like joy or frustration, and physical sensations of pleasure or discomfort. Nowhere did he discover a constant self existing apart from these experiences. There was no hidden observer behind the perceptions, only the perceptions themselves. What introspection revealed in Hume's view was not a persistent self, but an ever-changing flow of mental states. Consciousness, then, was not the property of a unified subject, but simply the succession of experiences themselves. There was no distinct entity experiencing thoughts and sensations, just the thoughts and sensations in motion. This led Hume to formulate what would become known as the bundle theory of mind, a radical departure from the traditional notion of the self. According to this view, the mind is not a container that holds experiences. It is the sum of those experiences. There is no enduring I that exists separately from them, only a shifting collection of perceptions tied together by mental associations. As Hume famously put it, the self is nothing more than a bundle or collection of different perceptions, constantly in flux and never standing still. There is no internal arena where mental events unfold, no unchanging subject who observes them, and no metaphysical self that persists through time. Instead, the self is simply the process of experiencing itself, without an independent underlying entity. The sense of being a continuous person, Hume argued, does not arise from a genuine metaphysical identity, but from the ways our minds link experiences across time. Personal identity, in his account, is a construction formed by the psychological mechanisms that organize our mental life into something that feels coherent. Hume identified specific cognitive tendencies that help sustain this illusion. One is the principle of resemblance, through which the mind connects similar experiences even when they are not identical. For example, remembering yesterday's red rose brings to mind an image that closely matches the original, reinforcing a sense of continuity between moments. Another is the principle of causation, by which thoughts and emotions are linked in ways that suggest they follow one another in meaningful sequence. This causal connection creates the impression of a unified, unfolding mental narrative, a consistent stream of thought and feeling that gives rise to the illusion of a self that persists. Together, these natural operations of the mind generate the compelling, but ultimately deceptive, sense of a singular, enduring self. For Hume, this coherence is not proof of an actual metaphysical entity at the core of our being, but rather the result of habitual mental processes that shape and organize our experiences. The simple desire to write a letter prompts you to remember where you last saw your pen, leading you to approach your desk. This seemingly minor action sets off a causal sequence, linking mental events that might otherwise feel disconnected. Most importantly, memory acts as the glue that binds past experiences to present awareness, enabling you to construct a continuous, meaningful story of your life that can span years or even decades. Yet, philosopher David Hume challenged the assumption that such coherence implies a lasting, unchanging self. He argued that the flow of consciousness results from natural psychological processes that operate instinctively rather than from any permanent metaphysical identity. Just as a river retains its name and form despite the constant motion of its waters, personal identity, according to Hume, is sustained not by a fixed inner being, but by the ongoing succession of related mental experiences. This sense of unity persists even as thoughts and perceptions shift from moment to moment, maintained by a chain of psychological connections rather than by any unchanging core. Hume contended that earlier philosophers misunderstood the nature of this unity by claiming it depended on a metaphysical constant. In his view, what appears to be a stable self is more accurately explained by ordinary mental processes working on ever-changing psychological content. Hume's reinterpretation of identity had far-reaching implications for moral responsibility and personal development. If the self is not a static essence but a sequence of mental events, then individuals are not permanently defined by past behaviors or traits. While there is enough psychological continuity to hold people accountable for their actions, there is also sufficient flexibility to allow for genuine growth and transformation. You are responsible for your past because your current state of mind is connected to earlier choices and behaviors through an unbroken psychological thread. At the same time, you are not forever locked into previous patterns. Your character can evolve through new experiences and conscious effort. Understanding identity as a fluid process rather than a fixed entity opens the door to both ethical responsibility and authentic change. It emphasizes that individuals can actively shape who they become by making deliberate decisions and fostering new habits. In this framework, the self is not a static possession, but an evolving construct formed through intention and action. Hume also acknowledged the crucial role that social context plays in shaping personal identity. He recognized that our mental development takes place through constant interaction with others and is deeply embedded in cultural frameworks. The sense of being a continuous and unified person is partly sustained by how others perceive and treat us over time. Social validation reinforces the internal mechanisms that maintain our self-conception, while stable roles and interpersonal relationships provide the structure through which identity can mature and become more defined. Thus, the self is not only a bundle of internal experiences, but also a social phenomenon emerging from shared human environments. This insight foreshadowed key developments in social psychology and sociology, where the communal and cultural foundations of personal identity became central concerns. Hume's perspective implies that to fully grasp what it means to be a person, we must also understand the historical and cultural contexts that shape self-awareness and social roles. However, despite the strength of his arguments, Hume was aware that his bundle theory of the self conflicted with basic human intuition. People naturally feel as though they are unified, enduring beings, even if careful philosophical analysis undermines the idea of a constant self. Hume regarded this as one of the deepest and most troubling dilemmas in his entire philosophical system. Although his view aligned with empirical observations of mental life, it ran so strongly against ingrained psychological instincts that even Hume admitted finding it difficult to embrace his own conclusions. This unresolved tension between rational theory and innate belief illustrates the complexity of human self-understanding and the challenge of reconciling different ways of conceptualizing identity. It also speaks to Hume's intellectual honesty. Rather than defend his ideas at all costs, he openly admitted their limitations and the challenges they posed, demonstrating a rare commitment to philosophical rigor. Part 14. The Passions and Human Motivation. David Hume developed one of the most intricate and psychologically sophisticated accounts of human emotion and motivation in philosophical history. Departing from the views of earlier thinkers who saw the passions as irrational forces that disrupt reason, Hume argued that our emotional and motivational states are the primary drivers of all human behavior. Through a meticulous analysis of human psychology, Hume revealed the complex mechanisms by which people form emotional connections, pursue goals, and navigate social interactions. This model became the foundation of his moral and social philosophy, where he located the origins of human institutions and customs not in detached rational principles, but in the psychological tendencies that naturally arise within us. Hume drew a crucial distinction between two broad classes of mental phenomena, each governed by distinct cognitive and emotional processes. The first includes impressions and ideas, our immediate sensory inputs and the memories derived from them, which relate to the mind's capacity to perceive and recall. The second encompasses the passions, our affective and motivational responses, which do not simply influence our thinking, but propel us to act. For Hume, the passions are the principal engines behind all human action. They generate our desires, fears, hopes, and aversions, emotions that chart the course of our lives. Without them, we would be mere observers of our thoughts, intellectually aware yet completely inert, lacking any drive to move or decide. While reason plays a role in identifying cause and effect relationships and determining the means to reach a given objective, it is passion that imbues these ends with importance and urgency. Therefore, any meaningful inquiry into human behavior, whether at the individual or societal level, must begin with an examination of the passions. Hume also proposed a detailed taxonomy of the passions, categorizing them based on their psychological origins. He identified a group of direct passions which arise immediately in response to pleasure, pain, or perceived benefit or harm. These reactions are instinctive and automatic, like the instant pain and reflexive withdrawal when one touches something hot, requiring no reflective thought or external influence. By contrast, indirect passions are shaped through more elaborate cognitive operations. They involve evaluations that connect the self with other individuals, objects, or events, and are deeply informed by social and cultural contexts. Emotions such as pride, humility, love, and hatred are not merely instinctual. They stem from how people interpret their experiences, assess causality, and compare themselves to others within a shared social world. These more complex emotions are crucial to the fabric of human social life. They motivate individuals to seek approval, avoid rejection, build bonds, and maintain their standing within a community. In this sense, indirect passions serve as the psychological infrastructure that supports social cohesion and collective interaction. Among these, Hume saw pride as especially revealing when it comes to understanding emotional experience. Pride arises when a person recognizes a quality or success they possess, something they believe will elicit admiration from others. The emotion involves a nuanced network of associations: the individual, the valued trait or achievement, and the anticipated approval of others. Consider, for example, someone who feels proud of their well-designed home. Their sense of self becomes linked to the aesthetic appeal or prestige of the house, and this link is reinforced by imagining how others might admire their refinement or social position. Thus, pride is more than a pleasurable sensation. It encompasses self-evaluation, social comparison, and the expectation of external validation. In this light, pride illustrates the inherently social character of personal emotion. It reveals how our feelings about ourselves are shaped by our perceptions of how others see us. Humility, conversely, functions as pride's counterpart. It emerges when individuals become aware of shortcomings or failures they assume will be judged negatively by others. The very psychological dynamics that produce pride when positive associations are present give rise to humility when those associations reflect poorly on the self. David Hume offered a profound insight into the relationship between pride and humility. Both emotions arise from how we evaluate ourselves in the context of societal expectations. This implies that our self-perception is not formed in a vacuum. It is intrinsically linked to how we measure ourselves against others. Self-awareness, then, is not merely an inward reflection, but is deeply influenced by our beliefs about how others perceive us and how our achievements correspond with shared standards and values. This line of thought anticipated later advances in social psychology, particularly the idea that our sense of self is constructed through interaction with others. Research in this field has since confirmed that comparison with peers plays a critical role in shaping our mental and emotional understanding of who we are. Hume extended this psychological framework to emotions like love and hatred, which, unlike pride and humility, are directed outward toward others. Love is generated when we associate someone with qualities or actions that produce pleasure and admiration. Hatred, by contrast, emerges when we link a person to traits or behaviors that cause pain, discomfort, or disapproval. Importantly, Hume emphasized that these emotions are not automatic or simplistic responses to others' characteristics. Instead, they involve complex judgments that take into account the motivations behind someone's actions, the broader social environment, and the cultural narratives that shape our interpretations. We are more likely to feel affection for individuals whose virtues seem to result from deliberate effort rather than mere luck or favorable circumstances. Likewise, our negative reactions intensify when we believe someone's harmful behavior reflects an underlying moral flaw, as opposed to being a reaction to external conditions or situational pressures beyond their control. In examining the nature of human emotions, Hume arrived at several pivotal conclusions concerning human motivation and moral psychology. First, he maintained that emotions and desires are the primary drivers of all human action, and that these impulses cannot be entirely justified through rational thought. Our core motivations and ethical values are rooted in emotional experience rather than in abstract logic. Consequently, moral and political theories must be grounded in the emotional fabric of human life rather than in purely intellectual constructs. Second, Hume argued that human psychology is inherently social in nature. It evolves through constant interaction with others and a continual sensitivity to collective judgments and social norms. This suggests that a proper understanding of human behavior requires attention to the social and cultural settings in which people operate, rather than focusing solely on internal cognitive processes. Third, Hume uncovered the sophisticated mental mechanisms behind emotional responses that may seem simple on the surface. He demonstrated that human beings possess advanced cognitive tools for interpreting social dynamics and for navigating the intricacies of interpersonal relationships. These findings form the foundation of Hume's approach to ethics and social theory. If human conduct is ultimately rooted in natural feelings rather than detached reasoning, then moral philosophy should aim to identify, cultivate, and support the emotional dispositions that foster human flourishing. It should not rely solely on abstract deduction. Moreover, if the human psyche is essentially social, then political institutions should be designed in harmony with emotional and communal tendencies, rather than demanding that individuals suppress their natural inclinations. Hume's empirical approach to morality and politics called for a science of human nature, one that studies ethics and governance through the lens of human psychology and the evolving patterns of social interaction. Part 15. Moral Sentiments and the Foundation of Ethics. David Hume revolutionized moral philosophy by redirecting its focus from abstract rational principles to the psychological forces that genuinely shape how humans behave ethically. Instead of attempting to construct moral systems from pure logic, Hume investigated how people actually form ethical judgments and what emotional and cognitive elements drive moral action. By applying an empirical approach to ethics, Hume arrived at the conclusion that moral values originate from human feelings rather than from objective, external moral truths. Crucially, he argued that basing morality on human emotion does not diminish its validity or seriousness. On the contrary, it enhances it. When we understand that emotions are the foundation of our moral outlook, we can better shape ethical education, inspire societal change, and foster personal growth. Hume carefully examined his own moral perceptions, inviting others to do the same, and uncovered a powerful insight into how ethical reasoning operates in the human mind. He recognized that moral evaluations are rooted in a distinct emotional response, not simply in personal likes or dislikes. For example, to say that murder is wrong is fundamentally different from saying you dislike a type of cuisine or a style of music. When we morally denounce acts like murder, we are not just expressing a personal opinion, but articulating what Hume termed a sentiment of disapprobation, a feeling that carries a broader, communal meaning. This moral disapproval is not confined to our personal experiences. We judge acts like murder as wrong whether they occur nearby or in distant regions, whether today or in centuries past. Such consistency reflects a deep, impartial sympathy, a concern for human welfare that reaches beyond individual interests. According to Hume, this moral sentiment has its roots in human psychology, shaped over time by both evolutionary pressures and the dynamics of social life. He held that people are naturally equipped with the ability to sympathize, an inherent capacity to emotionally register the happiness or suffering of others. Witnessing another person's joy or distress instinctively triggers a mirrored feeling within us. These sympathetic responses, while generally less intense than directly experiencing an emotion, occur spontaneously and are not the result of formal moral education or rational analysis. They create an emotional connection among people, a sense of shared experience. Over time, these instinctive reactions develop into more complex moral sentiments, guided and refined through cultural learning and social interaction. Sympathy, then, serves as the psychological and emotional foundation for making moral judgments. However, this capacity doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is molded by the social and cultural environment in which a person is raised. While our ability to sympathize is innate, the specific objects of our sympathy and the intensity with which we feel it are shaped by the norms and values of our surroundings. Still, Hume acknowledged the limitations of raw, unrefined sympathy. People naturally feel more empathy for those they are emotionally or socially close to, family members, friends, or members of their community, and less for those who are distant, unfamiliar, or culturally different. This kind of emotional favoritism often clashes with the impartial standards required by ethical judgment, which call us to consider all people's interests equally, regardless of personal proximity. Recognizing this challenge, Hume investigated how human beings evolve from these instinctive, partial sympathies toward a more fair-minded and inclusive form of moral reasoning. He concluded that mature ethical thought requires a kind of psychological growth, a widening of our natural sympathies beyond their original scope. This moral development hinges on adopting what Hume called the general point of view, a mental posture that allows us to rise above immediate attachments and personal biases. From this elevated perspective, we assess actions not merely through the lens of personal involvement, but as if we were neutral observers. This shift enables us to judge behavior by its broader consequences, weighing its impact on everyone affected, and not just on ourselves or our inner circle. This psychological perspective does not diminish the significance of emotion in moral reasoning. Instead, it refines and directs our instinctive empathic responses, transforming them into more coherent and socially constructive ethical judgments. By adopting a broader and more impartial outlook, individuals become capable of endorsing actions that promote collective well-being, even when such actions conflict with personal interests, and of condemning behaviors that cause unnecessary harm, even if they offer individual benefits. The capacity for fair and unbiased moral reasoning emerges organically through human interaction and communication. As people engage socially, they come to see that shared ethical frameworks facilitate trust, cooperation, and mutual understanding. Societies that succeed in cultivating robust moral norms and evaluative mechanisms are better prepared to tackle collective problems and sustain social order. David Hume's analysis of moral sentiment led to important insights about the dynamic between individual psychology and broader societal forces. Moral principles, in his view, are neither random commands imposed on unwilling individuals nor eternal truths existing independently of human experience. Instead, they arise from the natural growth of human sympathy, shaped and developed through cultural learning and interpersonal engagement. Consequently, effective moral education should aim to nurture and deepen our innate capacity for empathy, rather than relying solely on the rigid transmission of abstract ethical theories enforced through authoritative instruction. Children grasp moral concepts not primarily by memorizing prescriptive rules, but by participating in relationships that foster an empathetic awareness of how their actions affect others' well-being. In a similar vein, social institutions should be constructed in ways that resonate with inherent psychological tendencies. Rather than demanding that people suppress or override their emotional nature, these structures should create conditions that encourage and reinforce moral emotions as a foundation for ethical behavior. Hume's emphasis on sentiment-based ethics also provides meaningful insight into the nature of moral disagreement and cultural variation in ethical norms. If moral judgments originate from emotional capacities shaped by life experience, then variations in moral codes across cultures are to be expected, alongside shared themes that reflect the common psychological core of humanity. Certain ethical patterns recur across societies. Prohibitions against gratuitous violence, the emphasis on honesty in cooperative contexts, and a shared responsibility to protect children and other vulnerable members. However, the specific ways in which these values are enacted differ based on each society's history, cultural evolution, and environmental conditions. This understanding suggests that moral philosophy should aim to identify the fundamental emotional instincts that underlie ethical thought universally, while also respecting the legitimacy of cultural differences in their expression and institutionalization. An inflexible dogmatic application of moral rules without regard for their psychological basis or social context is unlikely to be either effective or conducive to human flourishing. Hume's ethical theory thus offered a middle path between moral relativism and moral absolutism, emphasizing both the natural origins and the social development of moral understanding. Ethical standards are not simply personal preferences or cultural artifacts. They are anchored in universal elements of human psychology, which impose real limits on what kinds of moral systems can genuinely support human well-being. At the same time, these norms are not fixed metaphysical truths revealed by reason alone. They are rooted in emotional dispositions shaped by evolutionary pressures and cultural conditioning. As a result, moral philosophy should take a naturalistic approach, one that draws from empirical research on human behavior and psychology, and that actively cultivates the emotional foundations essential to moral thought and practice. This naturalistic framework anticipated key developments in modern fields such as moral psychology, evolutionary ethics, and applied ethics. By highlighting the centrality of understanding human nature, it paved the way for more effective models of moral education and ethical policy making, and remains one of Hume's most significant and lasting contributions to the study of morality and human nature.